A mother vanished in 1985. 39 years later, a time capsule in her old backyard was dug up, and inside it was something that would change everything. It was the kind of discovery that made even seasoned detectives pause. A plain, rust-stained box, pulled from the dirt behind a quiet suburban home, would reopen a mystery most people thought was long buried. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to where it all began. The year was 1985. The air carried that familiar scent of cut grass and cigarette smoke, the kind that clung to neighborhoods in summer evenings when people sat out on porches and kids played kickball until the streetlights flickered on. This story starts in one of those towns. Her name was Linda Carter, 32 years old, mother of two. To most, she seemed like the picture of a suburban mom. She wore her brown hair feathered back in that classic 80s style, often paired with oversized sunglasses and a denim jacket she'd had since high school. She was the kind of woman who showed up at PTA meetings with a tin of brownies, who never missed her kids' soccer games, and who knew the names of the cashiers at the local grocery store. But Linda's story was more complicated than the version her neighbors saw. On the day she vanished, July 14, 1985, the town would later recall the sweltering heat. The cicadas screamed from the trees, and the asphalt shimmered in waves. That morning, Linda had woken early. Her husband, Mark, remembered the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway, the clatter of dishes as she set out cereal bowls for their kids. Their daughter, Emily, was 8. Their son, Ryan, was 5. They would remember that morning forever, though in fragments the sound of the cartoon theme song playing from the TV, the squeak of the screen door, the smell of their mom's perfume as she leaned down to kiss them goodbye. And then, nothing. By that evening, Linda Carter had vanished without a trace. The police would arrive, the neighbors would whisper, flyers would go up, and search parties would comb through wooded lots and creek beds. But nothing solid ever emerged. The years rolled into decades. Her children grew up, carrying with them a hole that nothing could quite fill. And then, nearly 4 decades later, a box came out of the earth. The discovery happened in the spring of 2024. The house where Linda had once lived had long since changed hands. A new family, the Harpers, had bought the property 3 years earlier. They had no idea about its past. To them, it was just a fixer-upper with good bones, the kind of house where they could raise their kids. That morning, contractors were in the backyard, hired to dig out space for a new patio. The ground was hard, packed clay and stubborn roots. One of the workers, a man named Javier, was swinging his pick when the metal rang out against something solid. At first, he thought it was just a rock. But as they cleared the soil away, the edges of a box began to appear. It was metal, about the size of a small cooler, eaten through with rust. The men hauled it up, setting it on the patchy grass. The latch had long since corroded, but when they pried it open, a wave of musty air escaped, the smell of earth and time. Inside were objects that should not have been buried. There was a woman's watch, the leather band stiff and cracked, a stack of photographs, curled and faded, one showing Linda herself, smiling on what looked like a summer afternoon. A set of keys on a keychain with the faded logo of a local diner, and at the bottom, wrapped in yellowed plastic, was a folded note. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but still legible. It read, "She didn't leave. She was taken." The workers stared at it, not fully grasping what they had stumbled onto. But within hours, police cars were parked at the curb, their lights painting the quiet street red and blue. Neighbors came out, drawn by curiosity, the way they always do when something big happens on an otherwise ordinary block. And as word spread, so too did the whispers. Some said the box had been planted, others swore it was a confession. And for Linda's children, now adults with lives of their own, the call they received that day was one they had waited nearly 40 years to hear. Their mother's name was alive again. The time capsule, as it came to be called, was unlike anything investigators had ever seen. It wasn't buried deep, only a few feet down, as if someone hadn't wanted to hide it forever, but instead, to leave it waiting, to be found at the right time. Detectives immediately reopened the case. Forensic teams handled the box with gloved hands, photographing and cataloging every item. The watch was sent for analysis. The photographs were scanned and enhanced. The note was treated like a crime scene in itself, with handwriting experts pulled in to examine the strokes. But as much as the discovery lit a fire under investigators, it also opened a door to something darker. because the more they dug, the more it seemed like someone had wanted Linda's disappearance to stay hidden. And the time capsule, buried in the soil of the very house where she once lived, was both a clue and a taunt. As one detective would later say, "It felt like whoever did this wanted us to know, just not then, not until now." And so the story, long buried under decades of silence, began again. But before we follow investigators into the twists and turns of what they uncovered, we need to step back. To understand Linda Carter's disappearance and what this discovery really meant, we have to go all the way back to 1985. Back to the day she vanished, and the small-town world she lived in, a world that looked safe on the surface but carried shadows underneath. Because mysteries like this don't begin in the moment someone disappears. They begin years earlier, in the choices people make, the secrets they keep, and the lies they tell themselves to sleep at night. This was no different. And Linda's story was about to come alive again. To understand the mystery that unraveled nearly 4 decades later, we need to step back into the world Linda Carter lived in. Because before she was a missing person, before her name was printed on faded flyers and whispered about in town gossip, she was a mother, a wife, a daughter, and a woman trying to hold together a life that was far more fragile than anyone knew. Linda was born in 1953 in the very town she would one day disappear from. She was the middle child of 3 siblings, raised in a modest 1-story house with peeling white paint and a tire swing that hung from the oak tree in the front yard. Her father worked in a steel plant on the edge of town, while her mother stayed home. Her days spent in a haze of chores, casseroles, and gossip exchanged over back fences with other housewives. By most accounts, Linda had a typical childhood. She wasn't the loudest or the quietest, not the star of the cheer squad, nor the bookish girl lost in the library stacks. She existed somewhere in the middle, pleasant and approachable. But people who knew her well remembered she had a warmth about her. The kind of warmth that made you feel like she was listening, even when you were rambling. She met Mark Carter in high school. He was 2 years older, with a beat-up Chevy that smelled of motor oil and cigarettes, and a smile that seemed to carry just the right amount of rebellion. They started dating after a Friday night football game, a classic small-town romance. By the time Linda was 19, she was married, and by 24 she had her first child, Emily. Ryan followed 3 years later. Life in the Carter household was, at least on the surface, picture perfect. Linda baked on Sundays, kept a tidy house with floral curtains and crocheted throws, and walked her kids to school when the weather allowed. She volunteered for the church bake sale. She sewed Halloween costumes from scratch, and she seemed to embody the suburban dream of the 1980s. But beneath the surface, things weren't as idyllic as they looked. Neighbors would later recall that sometimes they heard shouting late at night. Mark was known to spend long hours at the local bar, and while he was never charged with anything, rumors followed him, whispers of temper, whispers of another woman. Linda, for her part, didn't speak much about her struggles. She kept things bottled up, choosing instead to smile through it all. Still, people noticed small cracks. She was thinner in the months leading up to her disappearance, her cheekbones sharper, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. One close friend remembered Linda telling her in hushed tones, "Sometimes I just want to start over, somewhere new, just me and the kids." But for all her private worries, Linda was devoted to her children. Emily remembers her mother's laugh, how it filled a room and made even bad days seem lighter. Ryan recalls how she always knelt down to tie his sneakers, even when he insisted he was big enough to do it himself. These details, small and intimate, would become treasured memories when she was gone. The town, too, knew her as dependable. She never missed a shift at her part-time job at the diner downtown. She often left generous tips for the paperboy. When she disappeared, it wasn't just a family that felt her absence, but an entire community. The setting of her life mattered too, because small towns in the 1980s carried their own atmosphere. The Carter home sat on Maple Drive, a tree-lined street where children rode their bikes until dusk, and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar without hesitation. On hot nights, the smell of barbecue drifted through the air, mingling with the faint sound of radios playing Bruce Springsteen or Madonna. It was the kind of neighborhood where people noticed when something was out of place. And Linda's disappearance was the ultimate disruption. But before that day in July, she lived like anyone else, caught up in the rhythm of grocery shopping lists, kids' playdates, church potlucks, and endless loads of laundry. She had dreams too, though she rarely spoke them aloud. She kept a journal in the top drawer of her nightstand, where she wrote about wanting to see the ocean again, to travel beyond the limits of her town, to take her children to Disneyland. That journal, which would later be found by investigators, painted a picture of a woman caught between responsibility and yearning. A woman who wanted to be everything for everyone, but who quietly wondered if she was losing herself in the process. Her last entries in the weeks before she vanished are haunting to read now. One page reads, "Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched. I don't know if it's just me being tired or if it's real. I can't shake it." At the time, no one knew what to make of it. Friends thought it was exhaustion, maybe paranoia, but when Linda disappeared, those words would take on a new weight. In the summer of 1985, Linda Carter was more than just a face on a missing poster. She was a mother tucking in her children at night, a woman carrying private struggles, and someone standing at the edge of something no one around her could see coming. And on the day she vanished, all of those threads, her family life, her marriage, her quiet fears would collide in a way that left behind far more questions than answers. The questions that would linger for decades. Next, we turn to the day it happened, the scorching heat, the little details of that morning, and the chilling moment when Linda Carter slipped from the world as if into thin air. July 14, 1985, began like any other summer morning, at least on the surface. The heat had already set in before sunrise, heavy and suffocating, the kind that pressed down on everything and made the air shimmer. People in town still remember it as one of the hottest weeks of that year. The streets felt sticky underfoot, the cicadas loud enough to drown out conversation, and the smell of cut grass lingered from lawns mowed the day before. Inside the Carter home on Maple Drive, Linda was awake before the rest of her family. She padded barefoot across the kitchen linoleum, the cool tiles, a small relief from the warmth that clung to the house. She brewed a pot of coffee, the rich smell drifting through the hallway. She laid out cereal bowls for Emily and Ryan and set slices of bread in the toaster. To anyone looking in, it was the picture of an ordinary morning. Mark Carter, her husband, would later tell investigators that he remembered her humming quietly to herself, though he couldn't place the tune. Emily, just 8 at the time, recalled rubbing her eyes and seeing her mom at the stove, her hair pulled back, her favorite silver necklace glinting in the light. Ryan, only 5, said he remembered her perfume, the same scent she wore every day, something floral, something comforting. The morning played out like hundreds before it. The kids ate breakfast. Linda reminded Emily to grab her summer reading book. Ryan spilled juice on his shirt, and she knelt to dab at the stain with a rag. Mark left for work around 9, the sound of his truck rumbling down the street. But sometime after that, things shifted. Linda made a phone call around 9:30. Phone records would later show she called her sister, Karen, who lived 2 towns over. Karen remembered the conversation as short, almost rushed. Linda had asked if she could come by for a visit later in the week, that she needed to talk about something. Karen pressed for details, but Linda brushed it off, saying, "I'll tell you in person." That was the last confirmed phone call Linda ever made. By late morning, the temperature outside had climbed past 90. Neighbors saw Linda in the driveway, pulling laundry off the clothesline. She waved to Mrs. Henderson across the street, who later described her as looking tired, maybe a little distracted. That detail, insignificant at the time, would come to haunt Mrs. Henderson when she realized she had been one of the last people to see Linda alive. At some point between 11 and noon, Linda disappeared. When Emily and Ryan came home from a playdate that afternoon, they expected to find their mother waiting. Instead, they walked into a strangely quiet house. The kitchen still smelled faintly of toast. A half-drunk mug of coffee sat on the counter. The back door was unlocked, the screen door gently tapping in the wind. Emily, old enough to sense something was wrong, told police she remembered calling out, "Mom?" again and again, but there was no answer. Ryan, younger and confused, started crying. By 5 o'clock, when Mark returned home, the unease had turned into panic. He walked through every room of the house, calling her name. The car was still in the driveway. Her purse was on the counter. Her shoes sat neatly by the back door. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment and vanished into thin air. The police were called by 6. An officer arrived, took down details, and walked the perimeter of the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture. Nothing suggested a struggle. The officer's notes from that night read simply, "Adult female missing. Possible voluntary departure." That phrase, possible voluntary departure, would become a thorn in the investigation for years. To police, it was easy to believe she had simply left. After all, women did walk away from families sometimes, especially if there were marital problems. But to those who knew Linda, the idea was unthinkable. She would never have abandoned her children. That evening, friends and neighbors gathered in the yard. Mrs. Henderson brought over lemonade, as if the act of doing something normal might make things less surreal. Mark paced the house, chain-smoking, his hands shaking. Emily sat on the porch steps, clutching her brother's hand, refusing to let go. Search efforts began almost immediately. Officers with flashlights combed the wooded lot at the end of Maple Drive. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, calling Linda's name into the night air. Dogs were brought in, but the trail went cold just beyond the Carter backyard, as if she had stepped off the earth itself. Inside the house, investigators photographed everything. The untouched breakfast dishes, the coffee mug, the purse with her wallet still inside. One detail stuck out to them. Linda's watch was missing. She wore it every day, a simple leather-banded piece, yet it wasn't found anywhere in the house. That watch would later reappear in the time capsule unearthed almost 40 years later. But in 1985, no one could have guessed that. The first 24 hours came and went with no sign of Linda, then 48, then a week. Rumors began almost instantly. Some said she had been seen at the bus station. Others swore they spotted her car on the highway, though her car had never left the driveway. A few whispered darker theories: an abduction, foul play, maybe even someone close to her. For Emily and Ryan, those first days were a blur of strangers in uniforms, hushed conversations in the kitchen, and the aching absence of their mother's presence. Emily would later say she remembers sitting in her bedroom at night, listening for the sound of her mom's footsteps in the hallway, convinced she would come back at any moment, but she never did. That day, July 14, 1985, became the line that split the Carter family's life in two. Everything before it felt normal, ordinary, safe. Everything after was filled with questions, with fear, and with a silence that stretched on for years. And as the sun set that night over Maple Drive, no one in town could have guessed that this disappearance would become one of the most haunting mysteries the community had ever faced. The panic was only beginning, and by the next morning, the entire town would be pulled into the search for Linda Carter. The morning after Linda's disappearance, Maple Drive felt different. The sun rose the same way it always did, casting long stripes of light through the tree branches, but the usual calm of the neighborhood was broken by the presence of patrol cars, news vans, and groups of neighbors gathered on sidewalks, speaking in hushed tones. The Carter home, with its white siding and flower boxes, had transformed overnight from an ordinary family house into the center of a mystery. Police officers moved in and out of the home, carrying clipboards and bags for evidence. Yellow tape stretched across the driveway. Neighbors stood on their lawns with coffee mugs, their faces pale, whispering speculation. Everyone wanted to know where Linda had gone. Everyone had a theory. For Mark Carter, panic had given way to something else, a kind of desperate numbness. He chain-smoked on the porch while detectives asked him the same questions over and over. What time had he left for work? Had they argued that morning? Did Linda have enemies? Did she ever talk about leaving? He answered each question with a shake of his head, sometimes with clipped words, sometimes with silence. To some of the officers, his demeanor seemed suspicious, but others chalked it up to shock. After all, his wife of over a decade had seemingly vanished into thin air. The children were taken to their Aunt Karen's house that day, shielded from the chaos unfolding in their home. Emily clutched her backpack and asked again and again if her mom would be back soon. Ryan, too young to grasp the gravity, just asked why there were so many policemen in the house. Karen hugged them both tightly, her own fear masked behind forced reassurances. By midday, the search expanded. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. Flyers, with Linda's photo, a smiling portrait taken the previous Christmas, were printed and handed out at gas stations, diners, and grocery stores. Volunteers stapled them to telephone poles, the paper flapping in the hot wind. Search parties fanned out across fields and wooded areas. Lines of volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder, calling Linda's name. Some carried sticks to part tall grass, others brought flashlights to peer into drainage ditches. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the heavy summer air. But every search ended the same, with nothing. Rumors began almost immediately. Some swore they had seen Linda walking near the bus station. Others claimed she had been spotted at a gas station miles away. Police chased down each lead, but every sighting crumbled under scrutiny. Witnesses confused, times not matching, descriptions off. The more rumors spread, the harder it became to separate truth from invention. Meanwhile, the Carter house became a revolving door of investigators. Detectives studied Linda's purse, her wallet, the half-finished coffee cup on the counter. They dusted for fingerprints, bagged the sheets from the bed, collected strands of hair from her brush, but none of it pointed to where she had gone. The only odd detail remained the missing watch, a small everyday item, but one Linda was rarely seen without. Investigators couldn't decide whether its absence meant something or nothing at all. As days passed, tension in town grew thick. Some people openly supported Mark, dropping off casseroles and offering help. Others whispered that he knew more than he was saying. It didn't help that his alibi that he had been at work all day was difficult to fully confirm. Yes, he had clocked in, but there were gaps in his whereabouts throughout the afternoon. On the third day, reporters arrived. Local news stations ran Linda's photo alongside the words, "Mother vanishes without a trace." The story spread across the state, then the region. Cameras parked on the street, reporters shouting questions at Mark as he walked to his truck. Emily and Ryan's faces were blurred on screen as footage showed them being escorted into their aunt's house. The pressure on the family grew unbearable. Police organized a town hall meeting that week. Folding chairs filled the high school gymnasium as officers stood at the front, fielding questions from frantic townspeople. "Are you treating this as a crime?" someone asked. "Do you have suspects?" another demanded. The officers gave careful answers, vague reassurances, but the truth was plain. They had no leads, no suspects, no clue where Linda was. For her sister Karen, those days were torture. She replayed that phone call again and again in her head, the one where Linda said she had something important to tell her. What had she meant? Why had she insisted it could wait until they were face to face? If only she had pressed harder. The guilt gnawed at her, a guilt that would stay with her for decades. The children felt the absence in quieter, heartbreaking ways. Emily asked every night if she could sleep with her light on, afraid of the darkness. Ryan started carrying one of Linda's scarves, clutching it like a blanket. Their routines were broken, their sense of safety fractured. Every knock on the door made them think maybe their mother had returned. As the first week ended with no answers, the panic shifted into something heavier dread. The town, once so certain Linda would turn up, began to wonder if they were searching for a person or a body. The whispers grew darker. Was there someone in town who knew more than they were saying? Had Linda stumbled onto something she wasn't meant to? Or had the danger come from inside her own home? The Carter case was no longer just a missing persons report. It was quickly becoming a mystery that threatened to tear apart the fabric of the community itself. And for investigators, the frustrating truth was that the trail had already gone cold. When days turned into weeks and Linda Carter was still missing, panic gave way to something else: rumors. In a small town, rumors spread faster than fire, twisting through barbershops, beauty salons, and church pews, until it was impossible to tell what was fact and what was invention. Everyone had a story, everyone had a theory. At first, the whispers were simple. Some believed Linda had run away. "Women do it all the time," one diner waitress told a reporter, shaking her head as she poured coffee. "They just up and leave when they've had enough. Maybe she found somebody new." Others believed she had been abducted by a stranger. The image of a dark car idling on Maple Drive at night became a common tale, though no one could agree on the make, model, or even whether it had ever been there. Still, the idea of an unknown predator stalking their quiet streets sent shivers through the community. Parents began keeping their children inside after dark. Locks that had long collected dust were suddenly used every night. And then there were the wilder stories. One man claimed he saw strange lights over the woods the night Linda vanished, sparking talk of UFOs. A group of teenagers swore they had found strange symbols carved into trees near the creek, and soon whispers of cult activity swirled. None of these claims had evidence, but in the absence of answers, people filled the void with whatever explanation they could imagine. Reporters didn't help. The more sensational the story, the more airtime it got. News anchors spoke about Linda as though she were a character in a thriller, her disappearance framed as a mystery for the ages. The attention only fed the speculation. Meanwhile, suspicion began to turn inward, toward the people closest to Linda. Neighbors questioned Mark Carter's late nights at the bar. Old stories of his temper resurfaced, magnified under the microscope of suspicion. "I always thought something was off about him," one neighbor whispered. "Wouldn't be surprised if he snapped." Others pointed to Karen, Linda's sister, noting the phone call just days before the disappearance. What had Linda wanted to talk about? Why wouldn't Karen reveal more? Karen, heartbroken and overwhelmed, refused to speculate publicly, but the silence only fueled gossip. Even friends were not spared. One of Linda's co-workers from the diner admitted they sometimes walked home together after shifts. Soon, the story morphed into rumors of an affair, though no evidence ever supported it. In small towns, a shred of truth was enough to grow into a full-blown scandal. The police, overwhelmed, were forced to chase down each rumor, no matter how absurd. They investigated sightings of Linda in other towns, combed through reports of strange men loitering near playgrounds, and even questioned local churches about supposed cult gatherings. Each lead dissolved into nothing, leaving investigators exhausted and the community restless. Psychics even began to call the Carter family. Some claimed they saw Linda near water, others described her trapped in a basement. Mark received anonymous letters with scrawled messages. "Look closer to home. She wanted out. The truth is in the woods." Whether they were cruel pranks or misguided attempts at help, they only deepened the family's torment. In town, the atmosphere turned sour. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Every unfamiliar car drew attention. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter. And through it all, the Carter children grew up in a fog of uncertainty. Emily stopped telling friends at school about her mother, too tired of the whispers and the pitying looks. Ryan, younger, only half remembered the frenzy, but carried the weight of absence, like a shadow that never lifted. By the end of that summer, the official investigation had slowed to a crawl. With no evidence, no confirmed sightings, and no body, detectives found themselves with nothing but stacks of files filled with dead ends. The rumors kept coming, but none of them brought Linda home. For the Carter family, the silence was the worst part. Every night, Mark sat by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. Karen replayed that last conversation with her sister until it echoed in her dreams. And Emily and Ryan, in the innocence of childhood, clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, their mother would walk through the door again. But she didn't. And as the summer of 1985 turned into autumn, the whispers in town grew quieter, replaced by an unspoken truth. Linda Carter was gone, and no one knew why. The case, despite its early chaos, was already slipping towards something far colder, and the Carter family was about to face the long, unbearable years of waiting. By the end of 1985, the search for Linda Carter had lost its urgency. What began with helicopters, search parties, and nightly news coverage slowly dwindled into a handful of unanswered tips and thick binders collecting dust at the sheriff's office. The case wasn't officially closed, but in practice, it was as if Linda had slipped into a void, her absence becoming part of the town's fabric. For the Carter family, that first Christmas without her was unbearable. Emily wrote a letter to Santa asking for her mom back. Ryan, too young to fully understand, wandered the house with Linda's scarf clutched in his small hands, crying when anyone tried to take it away. Mark sat in silence at the table, the half-empty chair a painful reminder of what had been lost. Karen hosted dinner that year, doing her best to fill the silence with forced cheer, but nothing could hide the emptiness that lingered in every corner. The following year, fewer people talked about Linda. The flyers faded on telephone poles, curled and torn by rain. The local news turned to fresher stories. Neighbors who once stopped by daily began to stay away, unsure of what to say, afraid of stirring grief that never really left. Life in town went on, even as the Carter family remained stuck in place. For Mark, the years were heavy. He returned to work, kept the household running as best he could, but his temper grew shorter, his drinking heavier. Friends described him as hollowed out, a man who had aged 10 years in one. Some whispered their suspicions behind his back, never truly convinced of his innocence. Others pitied him, saying he was just a man broken by tragedy. Emily and Ryan grew up in the long shadow of uncertainty. Every milestone carried the ache of absence. School plays, birthdays, graduations. There was always an empty seat where their mother should have been. Emily grew protective of her brother, stepping into a role far too heavy for a child. She became sharp, wary, quick to mistrust. Ryan, on the other hand, carried quiet sadness, a kind that made him retreat into books and drawings, creating worlds where things made sense, where people didn't just vanish. Karen never stopped pushing the police. Every year, she called the sheriff's office on the anniversary of Linda's disappearance, asking if there were updates. Most of the time, she received polite but curt replies. "We're still reviewing the case. No new leads. We'll let you know if anything comes up." But nothing ever did. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, the case sat in a drawer, occasionally revisited when a new detective joined the force, or when a TV program on unsolved mysteries picked it up. Each time, hope flickered briefly before fading again. The family developed coping rituals. Every July 14th, Karen hosted a candlelight vigil at her home. Friends and relatives gathered, sharing stories about Linda, praying for answers. Some years, only a handful of people came. Other years, the crowd was larger, filled with curious townsfolk and strangers drawn to the tragedy. Emily and Ryan attended when they could, though as they grew older, the vigils became bittersweet. Each candle lit was another year gone, another year without answers. Time did strange things to the memory of Linda Carter. For some, she became a ghostly presence, frozen in the photograph on the missing poster, young, smiling, her life suspended in that single frame. For others, she became almost mythic, her disappearance a cautionary tale whispered to children, "Don't stay out too late, remember what happened to that woman." But for her family, she was neither a ghost nor a story. She was real, a mother, a sister, a woman who had been ripped from their lives without explanation. And the silence of the years only deepened the wound. By 2005, 2 decades had passed. Mark Carter died of a heart attack that year at just 55. His funeral was quiet, attended mostly by family. Some in town still whispered about his role in Linda's disappearance, but no charges had ever been brought, and with his death, any secrets he carried were buried with him. Emily married young, trying to build the stable family she had longed for. Ryan moved away, choosing distance over the constant reminder of loss. Karen stayed, the last one tethered to the house where Linda had once lived, tending the memory as best she could. By the time nearly 4 decades had passed, Linda Carter's name was rarely spoken outside her family. For the younger generation, she was just a story their parents told. The case had become one of many unsolved mysteries tucked into the history of the town. Until the spring of 2024, when a rusted box was pulled from the ground of her old backyard. The time capsule that would turn silence into questions once more, and shake the family and the community out of the cold fog of forgotten years. The spring of 2024 started like any other. The Harpers, the new owners of the old Carter home, had plans to remodel the backyard. To them, it was just a patch of overgrown grass and uneven dirt, a space they wanted to transform into a patio where they could host summer barbecues. They had no idea the ground beneath their feet had been holding a secret for nearly 4 decades. On a mild April morning, workers arrived with shovels and picks. The air smelled of damp earth, the sky a washed-out blue. Birds chirped in the oak trees lining the yard, oblivious to what was about to be unearthed. The crew joked as they dug, their voices carrying across the quiet neighborhood. It was mid-morning when one of the workers, Javier Morales, struck something solid. At first, he assumed it was just a rock, but the dull metallic clang told him otherwise. Kneeling down, he brushed away clumps of soil, and soon, the outline of a box revealed itself. It was rusted, about the size of a cooler, its edges corroded but intact. Curiosity quickly turned into unease. Why was there a metal box buried here, only a few feet beneath the surface? The men exchanged glances, the joking fading into silence. They called over the homeowner, who crouched beside them, her hands covering her mouth. Without realizing it, they had stepped into the heart of a decades-old mystery. The workers pried the box open with the end of a shovel. The latch snapped, releasing a musty breath of air, thick with the scent of rot and time. Inside, objects lay nestled in crumbling plastic. A woman's watch, its leather strap stiff and cracked. A set of keys dangling from a diner keychain. Photographs, curled and faded, showing a young woman smiling at the camera, frozen in the brightness of another time. And then, at the very bottom, wrapped in brittle cellophane, was a folded note. The handwriting was shaky but legible. It read, "She didn't leave, she was taken." The backyard, once nothing more than a blank canvas for a patio, was instantly transformed into a crime scene. Police cars swarmed the street within the hour, red and blue lights flashing against the old siding of the Carter house. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, gathered on porches, whispering as they recognized the name on the photographs. For those who had lived in town long enough, it was like stepping back in time. Linda Carter's name had been a ghost for years, spoken only in whispers. Now, it was alive again, her disappearance no longer buried in silence but clawing its way back into the present. Detectives carefully lifted each item from the box, placing them into evidence bags. Forensic technicians photographed everything, cataloging every detail. The watch was sent to a lab for analysis, the photographs scanned and digitally enhanced, the keys dusted for fingerprints long since faded. The note was treated like a relic, its ink and handwriting examined under magnification. What struck investigators most was the strangeness of it all. Time capsules are usually filled with tokens of hope, letters to the future, trinkets of memory. This one felt more like a message. Not buried to be preserved, but buried to be discovered at a specific moment. Why here? Why now? Detective Harris, the lead on the reopened case, would later say. It felt less like evidence and more like someone wanted to leave us a clue, or a confession. The discovery shook the Carter family to their core. Emily, now in her 40s, received a call from police that afternoon. When she heard her mother's name, she broke down, clutching the phone with white knuckles. Ryan, who had tried for years to bury his pain, felt it resurface all at once, leaving him numb. Karen, Linda's sister, wept openly, whispering, finally something. But alongside relief came dread. Because if the box was real, if it had truly been buried during or after Linda's disappearance, then it meant someone had known the truth all along. Someone who had lived in that house, someone who had stood in that yard, someone who had chosen to wait until now for it to be found. The police reopened the Carter case officially, pulling dusty files from the archives. The binders of dead ends and rumors were suddenly relevant again. Old witness statements were revisited, photographs re-examined. Forensic technology, which had advanced leaps since the 1980s, was now applied to evidence that had once been deemed useless. The watch, the keys, the photographs, the note, each item was a thread waiting to be tugged, and investigators believed that if they pulled hard enough, the entire mystery might finally unravel. The discovery reignited the community too. For those who remembered the summer of 1985, it was like reopening a wound. Coffee shops buzzed with speculation. Social media lit up with theories, some reasonable, others wild. Old rumors resurfaced: the car by the curb, the supposed cult in the woods, the whispers about Mark Carter. Younger generations, who had only heard the story as a kind of ghost tale, now searched archives, eager to piece together a mystery that had once consumed their parents. For the Carter children, it wasn't just a mystery, it was personal. The watch was one their mother wore every day. The photographs showed her in familiar places. The note spoke directly to the doubts they had carried for decades. Linda hadn't left them willingly, she had been taken. But taken by whom? And why? The backyard discovery was only the beginning. The time capsule had opened the door, but the answers were still buried in shadows. And as detectives began pulling on those threads, they uncovered secrets that had been waiting in the dark for almost 40 years. When the box surfaced from the Carter backyard, the case file that had sat untouched for decades suddenly landed back at the top of the sheriff's desk. What had once been an unsolvable mystery, a ghost story whispered over beers at the local bar, was now a living case again. The discovery of the time capsule transformed Linda Carter's disappearance from a faded memory into an urgent investigation. Detective Marcus Harris, 52 years old and seasoned from years of working homicides, was assigned to lead the team. He wasn't even a rookie when Linda vanished in 1985. To him, this was more than just another case. It was a chance to finally resolve something that had haunted his community since his teenage years. Harris began by reopening every file. Boxes of reports, statements, and evidence bags were spread out across a long conference table in the sheriff's office. Yellowing photographs of Linda, grainy black and white images of the Carter home, lists of phone calls, and notes scribbled by detectives long retired. Each page carried the weight of time, of people who had once tried and failed to find the truth. The first step was re-interviewing. Anyone who had been alive in 1985 and connected to Linda was contacted. Some were reluctant, their memories foggy after nearly 40 years. Others were eager to talk, to finally share things they had never said back then. The passage of time made some people braver, loosening lips that had stayed sealed for decades. Forensic science also offered new hope. The watch, for example, was tested with modern techniques. Underneath the cracked leather band, a partial DNA profile was recovered, not enough for a match yet, but enough to keep as a lead. The keys were swabbed too, though decades in the ground had eroded most traces. The photographs, once faded, were digitally enhanced to reveal details long lost to the naked eye. In one, the background showed a car parked at the curb, a model investigators couldn't confirm in the original prints. Now, they could clearly see it was a dark sedan, a detail that reignited old theories. The note became its own puzzle. Handwriting experts compared it to samples from Linda, from Mark, from her sister Karen, from co-workers, even from neighbors who had left town years ago. The slant of the letters, the shaky strokes, they hinted at someone older, or someone writing in a rush, or someone trying to disguise their hand. No match was conclusive. Detectives also scoured property records. Who had lived in the Carter house since 1985? The list was long: families who stayed for a few years, renters who cycled through, owners who bought and sold. Each name was cross-referenced, each background checked. If someone had buried that box, it had to be someone with access to the backyard. Meanwhile, Emily and Ryan were drawn back into the storm. Both had built lives far away from the town, carrying their mother's absence quietly but heavily. Now, reporters called them daily, cameras parked outside their homes. Emily, the older of the two, chose to speak publicly. At a press conference, her voice shook as she said, "For years, people told us she left. She didn't. That note proves it. My mother was taken from us, and someone out there knows who did it." Ryan, more private, stayed in the background. But privately, he met with investigators, answering painful questions about his memories as a child. He recalled details he hadn't spoken aloud in decades: the way the back door had been unlocked, the faint smell of his mother's perfume lingering in the air. These fragments, while small, mattered to detectives piecing together the puzzle. The community, too, felt the stirrings of unease. For some, it was excitement to the possibility of finally getting answers. For others, it was fear. Because if Linda had been taken, then that meant someone in their midst, someone who had walked their streets and waved to their children, had been capable of it. Detective Harris was careful not to dismiss anything. He reopened interviews with old suspects, including Mark Carter's drinking buddies, a co-worker Linda had confided in, and even a few men from out of town who had been in the area at the time. He revisited the old rumors too, though many still led nowhere. The cult stories were baseless, the UFO sightings, nothing but local lore. But some details, like that dark sedan spotted near the house, began to re-emerge with more weight. One thing was clear: the box had been buried for a reason. Harris believed it wasn't just a clue, but a message. The phrasing of the note, "She didn't leave, she was taken," suggested someone wanted to set the record straight, someone who knew what really happened. The big question was whether that someone had been the perpetrator or a witness too scared to come forward in 1985. As the weeks went on, the investigation gathered momentum. Crime labs across the state were pulled in, analysts combing over every scrap of evidence. Cold case detectives from neighboring counties offered their expertise. It felt, for the first time in decades, like the Carter case was alive again. But with that revival came new complications. The deeper detectives dug, the more they uncovered about Linda's life and about the people closest to her. Secrets that had been buried just as deeply as that time capsule. Secrets that would force the community to question everything they thought they knew. And slowly, a picture began to form. A picture that suggested Linda Carter's disappearance wasn't random at all. It had been planned. When Detective Harris and his team began peeling back the layers of Linda Carter's life, what they found was a town that looked ordinary on the surface, but had been hiding shadows for decades. Secrets don't stay buried forever, and just like the time capsule, some of those secrets began clawing their way out of the past. The first revelations came from Linda's circle of friends. Old interviews from 1985 painted a picture of a woman devoted to her children but quietly unhappy in her marriage. When detectives tracked down those same friends nearly 40 years later, the stories became sharper, less filtered. One admitted that Linda had confided about Mark's temper, how arguments often ended with him storming out to drink at the bar. Another recalled that Linda sometimes talked about leaving, about taking Emily and Ryan and starting over somewhere far away. Then there were whispers of an affair. In the old case file, there had been vague mentions of Linda spending extra time with a man she worked with at the diner. Back then, detectives brushed it off, chalking it up to gossip. But when Harris tracked the man down, now a gray-haired retiree living in Florida, he admitted that he and Linda had shared more than just friendship. It hadn't been serious, he claimed, but it had been real. He said Linda ended things weeks before she disappeared, telling him she wanted to fix her marriage. Still, the revelation painted her life in new colors. Mark Carter's shadow loomed large too. Though he had died in 2005, his presence was everywhere in the investigation. Old bar tabs showed he had been a regular at a dive on the edge of town. Several patrons from that era admitted that Mark often spoke bitterly about his wife, sometimes even saying she was holding him back. Detectives couldn't ignore how often his name surfaced, though proving anything after so much time had passed was nearly impossible. Beyond the family, detectives began digging into the neighborhood itself. Maple Drive had seemed safe in the 80s, but behind closed doors, there were fractures. One neighbor, who had been a teenager back then, admitted she often saw a dark sedan parked near the Carter house at odd hours. She never reported it at the time, fearing no one would believe her. Another recalled hearing shouting from the Carter's house days before Linda vanished, not unusual, she said, but louder, angrier than normal. And then there was the strange account from an elderly woman who lived 3 streets over. She swore she saw Linda walking quickly down the road the afternoon she vanished, her face pale, her hands clutching something. But when pressed for details, the memory faltered. Was it truly Linda, or just the tricks of age and time? Still, investigators noted it. Every detail mattered now. The town itself carried its own dark history. In the late 70s and early 80s, there had been a series of burglaries and assaults linked to a man who was never caught. Some wondered if Linda had crossed paths with him. Others believed it was too much of a coincidence. Detective Harris considered the possibility, but leaned toward something closer to home. The note in the box hadn't said she was gone. It had said she was taken. That implied someone close enough to know the truth. Meanwhile, the Carter children were learning things about their parents they had never known. Emily had suspected her father wasn't perfect, but hearing first-hand accounts of his rage and infidelity shook her. Ryan, quieter by nature, found himself conflicted, torn between loyalty to the father who raised him and anger at the possibility that he might have been involved in their mother's disappearance. The investigation also pulled at Karen, Linda's sister. Detectives asked again about the phone call days before the disappearance, the one where Linda had said she had something important to share. Karen admitted she had always believed it had to do with Mark. She thought her sister was preparing to leave him. But she had no proof, no details, just a gnawing instinct that became heavier with every passing year. What unsettled Harris most was the growing sense that Linda hadn't been a random victim. This wasn't the work of a stranger who happened to pass through town. The pieces pointed to someone in her orbit. Someone who knew her routines, someone who could slip in and out of her home without leaving obvious signs, someone who had access to her life in a way only a friend, a neighbor, or a family member could. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the Carter family's tragedy wasn't just about Linda's disappearance. It was about the cracks in the community itself. Cracks that had been papered over with friendly smiles, block parties, and Sunday church services, but which now split wide open under scrutiny. Every interview, every file, every faded memory seemed to hint at a darker truth. Linda Carter's disappearance had not been an accident, and it had not been random. It was deliberate. And as the investigation pressed forward, one chilling question began to take shape. If someone had gone to the trouble of burying that box, a watch, photos, keys, and a note, then what else might be buried, waiting to be found? Detective Harris believed the answer was close, closer than anyone wanted to admit. Because in towns like this, secrets don't stay hidden forever, and when they surface, they don't just change one story, they change everything. By the time summer of 2024 settled in, Detective Harris and his team had pieced together enough fragments to see the outline of something chilling. What had once been a cloud of rumors and contradictions was now sharpening into a narrative, one that revealed Linda Carter's disappearance had never been random, never an accident. It was orchestrated. And the roots of it ran deep, tangled in the very soil of her home and the people closest to her. The breakthrough came when forensic analysts confirmed that the DNA found on Linda's watch strap did not belong to her, nor to Mark, nor to her sister Karen. Instead, it matched a partial profile in a state database. The name attached to that profile was unsettling: Richard Fowler, a former neighbor who had lived 2 houses down from the Carters in the 1980s. Richard had been a quiet figure back then, a man in his late 20s who kept odd hours and worked construction jobs around town. He wasn't someone Linda's children remembered clearly, just a shadowy presence who waved from his yard or passed them on the street. In 1987, 2 years after Linda vanished, he moved away without explanation. Until the DNA match, his name had never appeared in the case files. When detectives tracked him down, they discovered he had died in 2012, but his past was far from spotless. Records showed multiple arrests for burglary, trespassing, and 1 charge of assault, though it had been dropped. Neighbors from that time recalled that Richard seemed to have an unsettling interest in women, often watching them too closely, lingering too long in conversations. The discovery painted a disturbing picture. Had Richard Fowler been obsessed with Linda? Had he taken her the day she disappeared? And if so, how had no one suspected him at the time? But the time capsule complicated things. If Fowler had been responsible, who buried it? Why leave behind a message, decades later, claiming she was taken? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered another thread. Interviews with former neighbors revealed that Mark Carter and Richard Fowler had argued more than once. One recalled a heated confrontation over property lines. Another said Mark had accused Fowler of lurking around Linda. Police couldn't confirm the details, but it suggested tension between the 2 men. What unsettled Harris was the possibility of collusion. What if Fowler wasn't acting alone? What if someone else, someone in Linda's circle, had knowledge of what happened and chose to remain silent? The note, after all, didn't just implicate someone. It suggested a witness, someone who wanted the truth known, but not in their own lifetime. The turning point came when detectives traced the ownership history of the Carter house. In the mid-90s, it had been sold to a couple named the Petersons. Records showed they had lived there for just 3 years before moving suddenly, without explanation. When investigators tracked down Mrs. Peterson, now in her 70s, she reluctantly shared a memory she had never spoken aloud. One evening, while gardening, she had dug a little deeper than usual and struck something metallic in the soil. She uncovered the edge of a box, not realizing what it was, and quickly covered it again, unsettled. She told her husband, who insisted they leave it alone. Days later, he buried it deeper. "It's not ours to uncover," he had told her. "It's not our story." Mrs. Peterson admitted she had always feared it had something to do with the Carter case. She had urged her husband to report it, but he refused. When pressed by detectives, she finally whispered, he was afraid of someone who was still alive back then. This revelation reframed everything. The box wasn't just evidence. It was a message hidden in plain sight, moved and reburied by people too frightened to confront the truth. And that truth seemed to point directly at Richard Fowler, but with the lingering possibility that someone else had been complicit. For Emily and Ryan, the revelations were both devastating and clarifying. Their mother hadn't abandoned them. She had been stolen. And the man who likely took her had lived just 2 doors down, smiling and waving as they rode their bikes down Maple Drive. But devastation grew when investigators admitted they still had no body, no remains. Without that, the full truth of Linda's final moments remained elusive. Had she been killed immediately? Had she been kept somewhere, hidden away, in those first desperate days? These were questions no one could yet answer. The more detectives pieced together, the darker the picture became. Linda hadn't been a random victim. She had been targeted. Her disappearance was the result of someone's obsession, someone's violence, and perhaps even someone's silence in the community. Detective Harris stood at a press conference in late August, his voice firm but grim. "We believe Linda Carter was taken against her will. We have identified a person of interest who is now deceased. But we also believe there are people still alive who know more than they have ever admitted, and to them, I say this: it's time to come forward." The town, once lulled into forgetting, was shaken awake. Old neighbors began calling in with new details. People who had once kept quiet now found their courage. Slowly, the puzzle that had tormented a family for nearly 40 years was coming into focus. The truth was dark, messy, and tragic, but it was finally being dragged into the light. And with it came the possibility of closure, but also the chilling realization that some answers might forever remain buried. When nearly 40 years of silence were broken by the discovery of that rusted box, the Carter family could never have predicted how much would come pouring out of the shadows. What began as a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved finally reached a conclusion, though not the clean one anyone had hoped for. Detective Harris's team had pieced together enough evidence to point firmly toward Richard Fowler, the neighbor who had lived just 2 doors down from the Carters in 1985. The DNA on the watch strap, the history of harassment, the eyewitness accounts of a dark sedan parked near the house, all of it built a damning picture. Fowler had been obsessed with Linda, watching her, waiting for a chance to act. That chance had come on the sweltering afternoon of July 14th, when Linda stepped into her backyard to gather laundry. The working theory was that Fowler lured or forced her into his car. From there, what happened was less clear. Without a body, investigators could not say for certain. Some believed she had been killed quickly, her remains hidden in a place Fowler never revealed. Others suspected she may have been held captive for a time. Fowler's old properties were searched, wooded lots combed, even an abandoned shed he once rented was examined, but no trace of Linda was ever found. For Emily and Ryan, the confirmation that their mother hadn't chosen to leave them was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief, because it finally silenced the cruel rumors that had followed them all their lives. Heartbreak, because it confirmed what they had always feared, that she had been taken violently, her life stolen by someone who lived within shouting distance of their home. Karen, Linda's sister, stood at a vigil in September 2024 and said through tears, "We finally know she didn't walk away. She loved her children. She loved her family. She was taken from us, and while the man who did it is gone, at least the world knows the truth." The town was shaken too. The idea that a man like Richard Fowler had lived quietly among them, hiding in plain sight, left many unsettled. Some neighbors admitted they always felt uneasy around him, but never spoke up. Others expressed guilt, wondering if something could have been done differently. The discovery of the time capsule, the strange, deliberate message, only deepened the sense of unease. Who had buried it? Why had it waited so long to be found? The Petersons, the couple who admitted to reburying the box in the 90s, remained haunted by their choice to stay silent. "We thought we were protecting ourselves," Mrs. Peterson told police. "But all we did was protect a lie." Their testimony became a reminder that silence can be as dangerous as action, allowing shadows to grow darker. In the end, justice came only partially. Richard Fowler was dead, beyond the reach of courts or prison bars. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no final confession. Forensic evidence and testimonies could place him at the center of suspicion, but the lack of a body meant lingering doubts would always remain. Still, for the Carter family, it was enough to finally begin grieving properly. A memorial stone was placed beside Mark's grave, engraved with Linda's name, her birth year, and the year she vanished. Beneath it, the words, "Beloved Mother, never forgotten." Emily and Ryan, standing side by side, placed flowers at its base, their faces etched with both sorrow and peace. For the first time, they had a place to mourn, not just a question mark. But closure is rarely absolute. There were still shadows that lingered, questions that refused to die. The largest of them was the note itself. She didn't leave, she was taken. Investigators never determined with certainty who had written it. Handwriting analysis suggested it wasn't Fowler's. If not him, then who? Was it a neighbor who knew what he had done but feared speaking up? Was it someone close to Linda, who carried the truth for decades before slipping it into the earth as a final act of conscience? Detective Harris admitted in interviews that the note was the piece that kept him awake at night. "The evidence points to Fowler," he said. "But the note tells me there was another set of eyes. Someone who knew, someone who carried that knowledge, and for whatever reason, chose to speak only through the dirt." And then there was the last haunting detail. Among the photographs found in the box, one stood out more than the others. It showed Linda smiling at the camera, but in the blurred background, barely visible, was a figure, a man standing near a car. His face indistinct, but his posture rigid, his head tilted as if watching. To this day, no one has identified him. For some, that photograph became the most chilling piece of all. A silent reminder that while the community had answers, they did not have all of them. That, even in closure, mysteries linger. The Carter family tries to live with that balance now, peace mixed with uncertainty, grief softened by answers but sharpened by what they still don't know. Linda Carter's story became more than just a tragedy. It became a reminder of how thin the line is between safety and danger, between what is hidden and what is seen. And in that small town, people still glance at the backyard on Maple Drive, the patch of earth where a box lay buried for nearly 40 years. They still whisper about the note, the photographs, the unknown face in the background. Because while Linda Carter's family finally has a measure of closure, the shadows her disappearance left behind remain lingering, unsettling, and unwilling to let go entirely. And perhaps that's the nature of mysteries like this. They don't end cleanly. They echo, they haunt. They leave behind a question that refuses to be silenced. Linda Carter's truth was uncovered, but her story will always carry one last unanswered detail. The question that still drifts through the town like a chill on the wind: who buried the box?
you.